Ambassador Zephyra's tentacles writhed in barely contained fury as she reviewed the latest intelligence reports from the Sol system. The holographic display before her showed impossible numbers that defied everything the Galactic Council understood about warfare, diplomacy, and civilization itself. These readings must be incorrect, she hissed to her aide, a nervous klaxon whose scales had turned pale blue with stress. No species could maintain such resistance for 3 standard years against a full council blockade. The aide's voice trembled as he spoke. Ambassador, I've verified the data 17 times. The humans continue to not only survive but somehow thrive under our embargo. Their industrial output has actually increased by 47% since we began the siege. Zephyra's compound eyes narrowed as she studied the tactical displays. When the Council had first encountered humanity 5 years ago, they had seemed like any other primitive species ripe for absorption into the galactic order. Their technology was crude, their world divided into squabbling nation-states, and their military capabilities laughably outdated compared to Council standards. The initial diplomatic contact had followed standard protocol. The Council's envoys had arrived with their usual demands: submit to Council authority, accept designated resource quotas, provide military conscripts for Council wars, and abandon any notions of independent expansion beyond their home system. Most species accepted these terms gratefully, seeing membership in the galactic community as a privilege worth any cost. Humanity's response had been delivered by a weathered woman who introduced herself simply as President Chen. She had listened to the Council's terms with apparent patience, asked several clarifying questions about the nature of the proposed relationship, and then delivered a response that had stunned the diplomatic corps. Thank you for your offer, she had said with a polite smile that somehow managed to be more threatening than any weapon. We appreciate you taking the time to visit our little corner of space. However, after careful consideration, we must respectfully decline your generous invitation to kneel. The word kneel had not appeared anywhere in the Council's carefully worded demands, yet somehow this human had cut straight to the heart of what submission to the Council truly meant. The envoys had been so taken aback that they had simply stared at her in silence for several long moments. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding, the lead envoy had finally managed. This is not an invitation. This is how galactic civilization functions. You will comply with Council directives. President Chen's smile had not wavered. No, I don't think we will. What followed had been 3 years of the most frustrating conflict in Council history. Traditional conquest was impossible due to the Council's own laws about preserving habitable worlds. Economic pressure had backfired spectacularly as humans proved remarkably adaptable at creating alternatives to Council technology and resources. Diplomatic isolation had been equally ineffective, as humans seemed genuinely unconcerned about their standing in galactic society. The breaking point had come 6 months ago when the Council learned that humanity had not only developed faster than light travel independently, but had begun establishing colonies and systems the Council considered strategically important. This was unprecedented. No species had ever achieved interstellar expansion while under Council sanctions. Show me the Kepler station incident again, Zephyra commanded. The hologram shifted to display a remote system, where the Council maintained a mining operation. 3 weeks ago, a human ship had simply appeared at the edge of the system and begun broadcasting on all frequencies. The message had been brief and to the point. The humans were establishing a research station in the system and had no intention of interfering with Council operations, but neither would they be removed. When the Council fleet had moved to intercept, something extraordinary had happened. The human ship had not fled or fought. Instead, it had simply sat there and broadcast another message. Detailed technical specifications for a new type of shield technology that made their vessel effectively immune to Council weapons. The implications had been staggering. Not only did humans possess defensive capabilities that rendered Council military superiority meaningless, but they had casually shared this technology as if to say, we could defend ourselves, but we'd rather you simply understand that attacking us is pointless. More human ships had arrived over the following days, and within 2 weeks Kepler Station was operational. Council ships that approached were politely asked to maintain a safe distance, not out of hostility but because human industrial processes apparently involved controlled gravitational anomalies that could damage nearby vessels. The final insult had come when the humans had actually sent the Council technical assistants to upgrade their own ship's shielding to protect them from incidental exposure to human technology. The message accompanying this aid had been signed by someone called Chief Engineer Rodriguez and had begun, "Hey there, space neighbors. Thought you might want these safety upgrades so nobody gets hurt while we're sharing the system." Zephyra's tentacles curled tighter as she remembered reading that message. The casual friendliness of it had somehow been more enraging than any declaration of war. These humans genuinely seemed to view the Council not as a superior civilization to be feared or respected, but as slightly backward neighbors who needed help with basic safety protocols. "What is the status of the Titan Accords?" she asked her aide. 17 Council member species have now signed separate trade agreements with humanity, Ambassador. They claim the humans offer better terms and more advanced technology than the Council can provide. This was the real crisis. For 3 millennia, the Council had maintained order in the galaxy through a simple principle. They were always the most advanced, most powerful, most connected civilization in any relationship. Species joined the Council because they needed what only the Council could provide. Humanity had somehow reversed this equation. They offered technology that surpassed Council standards, trade relationships based on mutual benefit rather than subservience, and perhaps most dangerously, they did all of this while maintaining their absolute refusal to acknowledge Council authority in any form. "Schedule an emergency session," Zephyra decided. "Full Council assembly. It's time we addressed the human problem directly." As her aides scurried away to make the arrangements, Zephyra stared at the tactical display showing human colonies spreading across 36 systems. Each one represented a fundamental challenge to everything the Council had built. The humans weren't just refusing to kneel. They were making it clear that kneeling had never been necessary in the first place. The Council chamber had never seen such attendance. Representatives from all 437 member species had gathered, their various forms of anxiety and agitation creating a cacophony of chittering, growling, and harmonic vibrations that the translation systems struggled to process. High Counselor Vorthak, a massive crystalline being whose thoughts moved at geological speeds, had called for absolute silence 3 times before order was finally restored. Captain Sarah Walsh of the Earth Defense Corps watched the proceedings from the observation deck with barely concealed amusement. She had been stationed on Luna Base when the Council's latest diplomatic overture had arrived, and Admiral Torres had personally selected her to attend this gathering as humanity's observer. The irony wasn't lost on her that the Council still insisted on calling these meetings internal affairs while simultaneously demanding human participation. "Human situation has become untenable," Ambassador Zephyra began, her tentacles weaving complex patterns of emphasis. "In the past year alone, they have established colonies in 43 systems, developed technology that surpasses our own in 7 critical areas, and worst of all, they continue to treat Council authority as if it were optional." A low rumble of agreement rippled through the chamber. Captain Walsh noted with interest that the sound came primarily from the older Council species, while many of the newer members remained conspicuously silent. Representative Quill of the Feathered Confederacy spoke next, his voice carrying the musical quality of his people. "Perhaps the Honorable Ambassador could explain why this represents a crisis rather than an opportunity. The humans have offered us trade agreements, technological exchanges, and peaceful coexistence. Many of my constituents question why we continue to view them as adversaries." The chamber erupted in angry chittering from several directions. Counselor Vorthak's thoughts resonated through the translation matrix with the weight of millennia. "You speak of matters you do not understand, young Quill. Order requires hierarchy. Without acknowledged supremacy, there is only chaos." Captain Walsh activated her personal recorder as the debate intensified. Admiral Torres would want a full report on this discussion, though she suspected he would find it as fascinating as she did. The humans had developed several theories about why the Council seemed so threatened by their independence, but watching the proceedings firsthand was providing valuable insights. "The Council has maintained galactic peace for 3,000 years, declared Representative Gorex, his massive mandibles clicking with each word. "We have done so by ensuring that all civilizations understand their place in the cosmic order. The humans threatened this stability by refusing to acknowledge their position. What position would that be exactly?" The question came from Representative Lyrian of the Silk Road Collective, one of the Council's newer member species. The humans appear to have achieved technological parity with us while maintaining complete independence. If anything, their position seems to be that of equals. The suggestion that any species could be equal to the Council sent waves of outrage through the older representatives. Captain Walsh found herself genuinely curious about what would happen next. In her briefings, she'd learned that the Council operated on principles that were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as they encountered humanity's stubborn refusal to play by established rules. Ambassador Zafira regained control of the floor with visible effort. The humans have recently completed construction of what they call a diplomatic station in the neutral zone. They claim it exists to facilitate better communication between the Council and independent systems. Intelligence suggests it's actually a forward base for further expansion. Captain Walsh suppressed a smile. She had helped design the diplomatic station herself. And while it certainly could serve military purposes if needed, its primary function was exactly what the humans claimed. The station's massive conference facilities, cultural exchange centers, and research laboratories were all designed to make it easier for Council species to interact with humanity without the political complications of formal diplomatic recognition. "Have we attempted direct negotiation with this station?" asked Representative Quill. "The humans insist that any negotiations must be conducted between equals," Zephyra replied, her tone suggesting this was self-evidently ridiculous. They refuse to acknowledge Council authority over galactic affairs and claim that all species have the right to determine their own destiny. The chamber fell silent. Captain Walsh realized that she was witnessing something historic. For 3,000 years, the Council had operated on the assumption that galactic civilization required a central authority that all species must ultimately answer to. The humans had proven this assumption wrong simply by existing successfully outside that framework. High Counselor Vorthak's thoughts began to resonate again, carrying the weight of geological time. "In my experience, which spans many of your lifetimes, stable civilizations require clear hierarchies. The humans represent chaos. They must be brought to order or eliminated as a threat to galactic stability." "Eliminated?" Representative Lyrian's voice carried shock. "Are we seriously discussing genocide over a diplomatic disagreement?" "It would not be genocide," corrected Ambassador Zephyra. "It would be the removal of a destabilizing element that threatens the peace and security of 437 civilized worlds." Captain Walsh felt her amusement drain away. She had hoped that the Council's resistance to humanity was purely political, but the casual way they discussed elimination suggested something much darker. She quietly activated an emergency beacon that would alert Earth Defense Corps Command to the shift in Council rhetoric. "I must object," declared Representative Quill, rising to his full height. "The Feathered Confederacy has extensive trade relationships with humanity. They have proven to be honorable partners who respect our sovereignty while offering mutually beneficial arrangements. Nothing in their behavior suggests they pose any threat to galactic peace." "That is precisely the problem," Vorthak's ancient thoughts rumbled. "They offer alternatives to Council membership. This undermines the foundation of galactic order." The debate continued for several more hours, but Captain Walsh had heard enough. The Council's fundamental issue with humanity wasn't about technology, territory, or even politics. It was about the simple fact that humans had proven that the Council's authority was not necessary for a species to thrive in the galaxy. As she prepared to leave the observation deck, Captain Walsh overheard a quiet conversation between two junior representatives from recently admitted Council species. They were discussing how their own worlds might benefit from the kind of independence humanity had achieved, and whether Council membership was truly worth the restrictions it imposed. She smiled as she made her way back to her shuttle. The Council might think they were debating how to handle the human problem, but what they were really witnessing was the beginning of their own obsolescence. Humanity hadn't set out to destroy the Council's authority, but by simply refusing to acknowledge it, they had revealed how fragile that authority really was. The real question wasn't whether the Council could force humanity to kneel. It was whether the Council could survive in a galaxy where kneeling was no longer required. The emergency alert reached Admiral Elena Torres while she was reviewing construction reports from the outer colonies. Captain Walsh's message was brief but alarming. The Council was openly discussing the elimination of humanity as a viable solution to their authority crisis. Torres had been expecting this escalation for months, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill down her spine. "Computer, connect me to General Morrison at Defense Command," she ordered. Within seconds, the weathered face of humanity's top military strategist appeared on her screen. General Morrison looked tired, which wasn't surprising given that he'd been coordinating humanity's defense preparations for 3 years without a break. "Elena, I got Walsh's report. How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we need to accelerate the Prometheus Protocol," Torres replied. "The Council's patience with our independence has officially run out." Morrison nodded grimly. The Prometheus Protocol was humanity's contingency plan for dealing with a full-scale Council military response. It had been developed based on the assumption that the Council would eventually resort to force when diplomacy failed to bring humanity to heel. "How long do we have?" Morrison asked. "Unknown, but probably not long. The Council moves slowly on most decisions, but they've been debating the human question for over a year. My guess is they'll try one more diplomatic solution before resorting to military action." Torres was proven correct 6 days later, when a massive Council fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system. The formation included warships from over 50 different species, representing the largest combined military force the Council had ever assembled. At its center was the Eternal Judgment, High Counselor Vorthak's personal flagship and one of the most powerful vessels in the galaxy. The fleet maintained position just outside the solar system's outer planets, close enough to demonstrate their capability, but far enough to avoid any appearance of immediate aggression. Their message was delivered with typical Council formality. To the government of the species known as humanity, the Galactic Council offers one final opportunity for peaceful resolution of our dispute. You will accept standard terms of Council membership, including resource allocation quotas, military conscription requirements, and acknowledgement of Council authority over interstellar expansion. You have 72 standard hours to comply. Failure to accept these terms will result in enforcement action. President Chen's response was broadcast from Earth within 6 hours, and its tone was notably different from humanity's previous diplomatic communications. Gone was the polite friendliness that had characterized earlier interactions. In its place was something that made several Council species quite uncomfortable: quiet confidence backed by obvious preparation. To High Counselor Vorthak and the assembled Council fleet, we appreciate your willingness to travel so far for this conversation. However, our position remains unchanged. Humanity will not submit to external authority, accept imposed quotas, or abandon our sovereign right to expand into space as we see fit. We suggest you reconsider the wisdom of enforcement action. What made the message particularly unsettling was what it didn't say. There were no threats, no demands, no emotional appeals. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with the kind of calm assurance that suggested humanity was prepared for whatever came next. The Council's response revealed the depth of their miscalculation. They had expected fear, desperate negotiations, or perhaps angry defiance. Instead, they received polite indifference to their threats, as if humanity viewed the massive fleet at their doorstep as a minor inconvenience rather than an existential threat. High Counselor, Vorthak's crystalline form pulsed with agitation as he reviewed intelligence reports from within the Sol system. Human military preparations were unlike anything in Council experience. Rather than massing fleets for defense, they seemed to be implementing some kind of distributed strategy that intelligence analysts couldn't fully understand. "Explain to me how a species, with only 5 years of faster-than-light capability, can appear so unconcerned about our presence," Vorthak demanded of his tactical staff. Admiral Korath, a veteran of dozens of Council enforcement actions, studied the sensor readings with growing unease. "Sir, their defensive preparations don't follow any logical pattern. They have ships scattered throughout the system, but not in any formation that would allow for effective fleet action. Most of their orbital installations appear to be industrial rather than military. Perhaps they simply don't understand the magnitude of the force arrayed against them," suggested Intelligence Coordinator. 6 Admiral Korath shook his massive head. "No, sir. Our communications intercepts suggest they're fully aware of our capabilities. They simply don't seem concerned." This was the disturbing truth that the Council was beginning to confront. Humanity's response to the ultimatum wasn't based on ignorance or bravado. Their casual dismissal of the Council's threat suggested they had capabilities that weren't immediately, apparent. The first hint of what those capabilities might be came 18 hours before the ultimatum expired. Long-range sensors detected a series of gravitational anomalies appearing throughout the galaxy, all centered on systems where humans had established colonies. The anomalies were brief but massive, suggesting the activation of technology that operated on scales the Council couldn't comprehend. "Sir," Admiral Korath reported to Vorthak with obvious reluctance, "we're receiving reports from 43 systems. Human colonies are transforming." The holographic displays showed impossible images. Human industrial installations that had appeared modest by Council standards were suddenly revealing their true nature. Asteroid mining operations expanded into massive shipyards. Research stations deployed weapons platforms that dwarfed anything in the Council arsenal. Colonial habitats unfolded into fortress cities protected by energy barriers that made them effectively invulnerable. How is this possible? Vorthak's thoughts resonated with something approaching panic. Our intelligence indicated these were civilian installations. They were civilian installations, sir. The humans appear to have developed modular technology that can serve multiple purposes. Every mining ship doubles as a warship. Every research station can become a fortress. Every industrial facility can produce military hardware. The true scope of humanity's preparations became clear as the final hours of the ultimatum ticked away. The species that the Council had viewed as primitive and isolated had actually spent 5 years preparing for exactly this confrontation. They had built their entire interstellar civilization as a distributed, redundant, adaptive network that could respond to threats in ways the Council had never encountered. More disturbing still were the reports coming in from Council member species. 17 different worlds were reporting that their human trade partners had quietly withdrawn from all commercial arrangements over the past week. The humans hadn't made any threats or ultimatums. They had simply informed their trading partners that circumstances might make continued commerce inadvisable for the immediate future. The implications were staggering. Humanity had developed economic relationships with Council species that those species now considered essential. The sudden loss of human technology and resources was already causing supply shortages and industrial disruptions across dozens of worlds. As the ultimatum entered its final 6 hours, High Counselor Vorthak found himself confronting a possibility that 3,000 years of Council dominance had never prepared him for. He might have led the greatest military force in galactic history into a trap that had been 5 years in the making. The 72-hour ultimatum expired with no response from Earth beyond President Chen's original message. High Counselor Vorthak had expected this outcome, but facing the reality of ordering an attack on an inhabited system still gave his ancient consciousness pause. In 3 millennia of Council enforcement actions, they had never needed to destroy a homeworld to make their point. "Begin the demonstration," he ordered Admiral Korath. "Target their outer industrial installations. Make it clear that we have the capability to eliminate their civilization if they continue to resist." The Council fleet moved into attack formation with the practiced efficiency of countless previous campaigns. Weapon systems that could shatter moons powered up across hundreds of vessels. The display of force was intended to be overwhelming, a final show of Council superiority that would bring the humans to their senses. The attack began at 1432 Universal Standard Time with a coordinated bombardment of human installations throughout the outer solar system. Plasma lances and quantum torpedoes struck their targets with devastating accuracy, releasing enough energy to obliterate small asteroids. The Council's weapons were precise, powerful, and utterly ineffective. "Sir?" Admiral Korath's voice carried a note of disbelief. "The human installations are unharmed. The tactical displays showed impossible readings. Direct hits from weapons capable of cracking planets had simply been absorbed by defensive barriers that seemed to violate several fundamental laws of physics. The humans weren't deflecting or avoiding the attacks. They were simply ignoring them. "Increase firepower," Vorthak commanded. "Full bombardment all targets." The Council fleet unleashed everything it had. Energy beams that could boil oceans, kinetic projectiles that could punch through planetary cores, and exotic weapons that manipulated space-time itself. For 17 minutes, the solar system was illuminated by the most concentrated display of destructive force in recorded galactic history. When the bombardment ended, Every human installation remained completely intact. More than that, the humans had apparently used the interval to deploy additional defensive platforms that hadn't been there before the attack began. "Admiral," came a transmission from one of the human stations. "This is Commander Rodriguez. Thanks for the fireworks display, but you're creating a navigation hazard for civilian traffic. Could you maybe dial it back a bit?" The casual tone of the message was more shocking than any threat could have been. The humans had just weathered an attack that could have sterilized continents, and they were treating it like a minor annoyance. "How are their defenses so effective?" Vorthak demanded. Admiral Korath consulted his tactical staff before responding. "Sir, our scientists believe they're using controlled spatial distortions to redirect incoming energy into parallel dimensions. The technology involved is beyond our current understanding." "Then we adapt," Vorthak declared. "All ships prepare for close assault. If we cannot damage them at range, we will engage at point-blank range." This decision marked the moment when the Council's strategy shifted from demonstration to desperation. As their fleet moved closer to human installations, proximity sensors began detecting readings that defied explanation. The humans weren't just defending themselves. They were doing something that violated every principle of space combat the Council understood. "Sir," reported the sensor technician, "human vessels are appearing throughout our formation." The tactical display showed the impossible truth. Human ships were materializing inside the Council formation, not through conventional faster-than-light travel, but through what appeared to be direct spatial translocation. One moment the space was empty. The next, a human vessel was there as if it had always been there. All ships. "Engage the human vessels," Admiral Korath ordered. The battle that followed lasted less than 4 minutes and redefined everything the galaxy thought it knew about space warfare. The human ships didn't fight in any conventional sense. They didn't fire weapons, deploy offensive systems, or attempt to destroy Council vessels. Instead, they simply made the Council fleet unable to function. Council ships found their weapon systems politely but firmly disabled by human boarding parties who appeared inside supposedly secure vessels without triggering any alarms. Engine systems were carefully shut down by human engineers who apologized for the inconvenience while making it impossible to restart them. Command bridges were occupied by human diplomats who offered coffee and asked if anyone needed medical attention. "This is Captain Sarah, Chen of the Earth Defense Corps," came a transmission to the Council flagship. "We're going to need all Council personnel to evacuate to the human vessels for their own safety. Your ships are about to experience some technical difficulties." Before Admiral Korath could respond, every system on the Eternal Judgment went dark. Emergency power failed to engage. Life support systems shut down with disturbing precision. The massive warship that had been the terror of dozens of species was suddenly as helpless as a derelict hulk. Human rescue teams were already docking with Council vessels. Before most crews realized what was happening, they moved through the ships with impossible efficiency, evacuating confused and terrified Council personnel to human vessels that appeared designed specifically for humanitarian operations. "What is happening to our ships?" Vorthak demanded as he found himself aboard a human rescue vessel. Captain Chen, who appeared to be in her early 30s despite sharing a name with Earth's president, smiled with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "Your ships are being safely deactivated and prepared for return to Council space. Don't worry. No one will be harmed and all your vessels will be fully functional once they're back in your territory." "This is an act of war," Admiral Korath protested. "Actually, Admiral, this is a rescue operation," Captain Chen replied. "Your fleet was attempting to engage defensive systems that would have been lethal to anyone within several light minutes of the engagement zone. We couldn't allow you to accidentally destroy yourselves." The scope of humanity's capabilities became clear over the following hours. Every Council vessel in the fleet had been effortlessly disabled, and their crews safely evacuated. The humans hadn't fired a single shot in anger, hadn't killed a single Council citizen, and hadn't even damaged any Council property beyond minor wear from the evacuation procedures. More disturbing was the realization that the humans could have done anything they wanted to the Council fleet. They could have destroyed every ship, captured every crew member, or simply made the entire fleet disappear. Instead, they had chosen the most compassionate response possible while still making their point absolutely clear. "You could have killed us all," Vorthak observed, his ancient mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. Captain Chen nodded seriously. Yes, we could have. We could have prevented you from entering our space in the first place, or simply relocated your entire fleet to the other side of the galaxy, but that wouldn't have solved the underlying problem. What problem? The problem that the Council believes it has the right to threaten other species into submission, Captain Chen replied. We wanted to demonstrate that such threats are not only morally wrong but also completely pointless. You cannot force someone to kneel who possesses the power to prevent you from standing. The journey back to Council space took 3 days, during which the rescued Council personnel found themselves experiencing something unprecedented in galactic history, being prisoners who were treated better than most species treated their honored guests. The human rescue ships were equipped with accommodations for dozens of different alien physiologies, food synthesizers programmed with traditional recipes from hundreds of worlds, and entertainment systems loaded with cultural archives from across the galaxy. High Counselor Vorthak spent much of the journey in what humans called the observation lounge, staring out at the stars and trying to comprehend what had happened to 3,000 years of Council supremacy. Captain Chen visited him regularly, not to interrogate or threaten, but to engage in conversations that left the ancient crystalline being more disturbed than any torture could have. Your species has possessed this level of technology for how long? Vorthak asked during one such conversation. Define this level, Captain Chen replied, settling into a chair designed to accommodate her human physiology while facing Vorthak's crystalline form. If you mean faster than light travel, about 5 years. If you mean the defensive systems that protected our installations, about 3 years. If you mean the spatial manipulation technology that disabled your fleet, about 18 months. The timeline was impossible. Species typically required centuries or millennia to develop technologies that advanced. Even the Council's greatest technological leaps had taken decades of collaborative research across multiple species. How is such rapid advancement possible? Captain Chen smiled, and Vorthak was beginning to recognize that particular expression. It wasn't mockery or superiority. It was the look humans wore when they were about to explain something that would fundamentally challenge his understanding of reality. Council species develop technology through hierarchical research institutions that follow established protocols and respect traditional limitations, she said. Human technology development is driven by millions of independent researchers, inventors and engineers who compete with each other, share ideas freely, and ignore most traditional limitations. But surely such chaos would lead to inefficiency and redundancy. It does, Captain Chen agreed cheerfully. It also leads to breakthrough innovations that hierarchical systems would never discover. When you have millions of humans working on the same problem from different angles, someone usually finds a solution that nobody else would have thought of. Vorthak's thoughts resonated with confusion. But how do you maintain quality control? How do you prevent dangerous research? How do you ensure that technology serves the greater good? We don't, Captain Chen said simply. We trust our people to be responsible. We deal with problems as they arise, and we accept that freedom sometimes leads to mistakes. It's messier than the Council way, but it's also much more innovative. This conversation was repeated in various forms across all the human rescue ships. Council personnel found themselves engaged in discussions with humans who seemed genuinely curious about alien perspectives, while being completely unintimidated by Council authority. The humans asked questions about Council culture, technology, and governance with the kind of academic interest usually reserved for studying primitive civilizations. More disturbing for many, Council species was the realization that the humans knew more about Council capabilities than the Council knew about human capabilities. Every human ship carried detailed files on Council technology, military doctrine, political structures, and even individual personnel records. They had been studying the Council with scientific precision for years, while the Council had consistently underestimated human potential. You've been preparing for this confrontation since first contact, Admiral Korath observed to his human escort Commander Park. Actually, we've been preparing for peaceful coexistence since first contact, Commander Park corrected. But we're not naive. We knew that the Council's history suggested they would eventually resort to force if diplomacy failed, so we prepared for that possibility while hoping it wouldn't be necessary. And if we had simply accepted your independence from the beginning? Commander Park shrugged. Then we'd be trading partners and occasional allies dealing with galactic problems together. Which is still an option, by the way. As the rescue fleet approached Council space, reports began arriving that painted a picture of chaos throughout the galactic government. The complete defeat of the Council's most powerful fleet had sent shockwaves through member species who had never imagined such an outcome was possible. Some species were demanding immediate retaliation against humanity. Others were calling for emergency negotiations. A growing number were questioning whether Council membership was worth the restrictions it imposed. The Feathered Confederacy had been the first to formally request withdrawal from Council authority, citing their existing trade relationships with humanity as evidence that Council protection was unnecessary. Within hours, 17 other species had submitted similar requests. The Council was facing its first major membership crisis in over a millennium. "What do you hope to accomplish by releasing us?" Vorthak asked Captain Chen as they approached the Council capital world. "We hope to accomplish exactly what we've always wanted," she replied. "A galaxy where species can choose their own destinies without being threatened into submission. Your fleet came to force us to kneel. We responded by demonstrating that kneeling is optional. And if the Council refuses to accept this demonstration, if we continue to view humanity as a threat," Captain Chen's expression grew serious, "then you'll continue to be wrong about the nature of the threat. We don't want to destroy the Council, Counselor. We want to make it irrelevant." Irrelevant? A government that maintains order through threats only remains powerful as long as those threats are credible, Captain Chen explained. "You've just discovered that your threats against us are not credible. How long do you think it will take your member species to realize that your threats against them might not be credible either?" The human rescue fleet reached the edge of Council space exactly 72 hours after the original ultimatum had expired. With typical human precision, every disabled Council vessel was restored to full functionality and returned to its crew. The Council personnel were transferred back to their ships with their personal effects. Detailed medical reports showing they had been well cared for, and something that shook many of them more than the military defeat. Thank you notes from their human escorts expressing hope for better relations in the future. High Counselor. Vorthak returned to his flagship to find it not only undamaged but actually improved. The humans had quietly upgraded several systems, fixed minor maintenance issues, and left behind technical documentation that would allow Council engineers to understand and maintain the improvements. Attached to the technical documentation was a personal message from President Chen. "Counselor Vorthak, we regret that our first meeting had to occur under these circumstances. Humanity remains committed to peaceful coexistence with all galactic species, including the Council. We hope that future interactions can focus on mutual benefit rather than dominance. The galaxy is large enough for all of us to thrive without anyone having to kneel." 6 months after the failed enforcement action against humanity, the Galactic Council convened what would later be remembered as the most consequential assembly in galactic history. The Grand Chamber that had once hosted 437 member species now accommodated only 212. The rest had formally withdrawn from Council authority in the wake of what historians would call the Sol demonstration. High Counselor Vorthak's crystalline form had dimmed considerably since his return from human space. The ancient being who had once embodied the eternal authority of galactic order now struggled to maintain the facade of Council supremacy in the face of its obvious obsolescence. "The Council faces an unprecedented crisis," he announced to the assembled representatives. "Not merely the loss of member species, but the fundamental challenge to our authority that humanity represents." Ambassador Zephyra, whose tentacles now moved with nervous energy, rather than righteous fury, presented the intelligence reports that had been arriving steadily since the Sol incident. The picture they painted was of a galaxy transforming in ways the Council had never anticipated. 43 species have established direct diplomatic relationships with humanity, she reported. 67 have initiated trade agreements outside Council oversight. Most disturbing, 18 species have begun developing what they call defensive cooperation pacts with human colonies. The defensive cooperation pacts were particularly troubling for the Council. They represented something entirely new in galactic politics. Voluntary alliances between independent species based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchical authority. The humans offered advanced defensive technology and rapid response, guarantees in exchange for scientific collaboration and cultural exchange. These alliances are spreading faster than we can monitor, Saphira continued. The humans have established what they call embassy stations in over 100 systems, providing diplomatic, technological, and humanitarian services to any species that requests them. Representative Quill of the Feathered Confederacy, now serving as an independent observer rather than a council member, had been invited to address the assembly. His words carried the weight of someone who had experienced both council authority and human partnership. Honored representatives, he began, I speak not to criticize the council's past accomplishments, but to offer perspective on the choice that now faces every species in this galaxy. The Feathered Confederacy has thrived under human partnership in ways that were impossible under council restrictions. He gestured to a holographic display showing his home system. Our population has grown by 30%. Our technology has advanced more in 6 months than in the previous century. Our young people look to the stars with hope rather than resignation. All of this has been achieved without surrendering our sovereignty or cultural identity. And what of galactic stability? Demanded Representative Gorex. What of order? What of the principles that have maintained peace for 3 millennia? Quill's response was gentle but devastating. Representative Gorex, with respect, the peace you speak of was maintained through the threat of force against species that had no choice but to submit. What humanity has shown us is that true stability comes from cooperation between equals, not from the dominance of the strong over the weak. The debate that followed revealed the depth of the crisis facing the Council. Species that remained under Council authority found themselves increasingly isolated as their neighbors formed partnerships with humanity and each other. Trade routes were shifting away from Council-controlled systems. Scientific research was moving to human embassy, stations where information was shared freely, rather than restricted by Council protocols. Perhaps most damaging was the simple fact that species under human partnership were obviously happier, more prosperous, and more secure than those still bound by Council authority. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. What does humanity want from us? Asked Representative Six in a moment of frustrated honesty. If they possess such superior capabilities, why don't they simply conquer us and establish their own galactic order? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Council understood about power and governance. It was answered not by a Council member but by Captain Sarah Chen, who had requested permission to address the Assembly as humanity's informal representative. Because conquest would make us into the same thing the Council has become, she said simply. We learned from your example that forcing others to kneel eventually makes you into someone worth kneeling to. Humanity has no interest in ruling the galaxy. We're interested in living in it alongside everyone else. Her words sparked a new round of debate, but the fundamental issue had been laid bare. The Council's authority had always rested on the assumption that galactic civilization required hierarchy, that some species must kneel for others to stand. Humanity had proven this assumption false by creating a model of interstellar civilization based on voluntary cooperation between sovereign equals. High Counselor Forthak's final speech to the Assembly was delivered with the weight of geological time, but also with something new: humility. For 3,000 years, the Council has believed that our role was to maintain order through authority, he said. We told ourselves that this authority was necessary, that without it there would be chaos, that our dominance served the greater good of galactic civilization. His crystalline form pulsed with what might have been sadness. Humanity has shown us that we were wrong. Not wrong about the need for cooperation, not wrong about the value of peace, but wrong about the methods required to achieve these things. They have built a better way. The final vote was closer than many had expected. 137 species chose to remain under traditional Council authority. 75 voted to dissolve the Council and establish a new model of galactic governance based on voluntary cooperation. The galaxy would now have 2 very different approaches to interstellar civilization. As the Assembly concluded, Captain Chen found herself in conversation with several representatives who were struggling to understand how humanity had achieved what seemed impossible. How did you know it would work? Asked Representative Lyrian. How could you be certain that cooperation would prove stronger than authority? Captain Chen smiled with the expression that had become familiar to Council observers over the past months. We weren't certain it would work. We were certain that authority without consent was wrong. Sometimes doing the right thing turns out to also be the effective thing. The transformation of galactic civilization continued over the following years. The traditional council maintained control over approximately one-third of inhabited systems, governing through the hierarchical authority that had served them for millennia. The remaining systems developed into a loose confederation of independent species, connected by trade, mutual defense agreements, and shared research initiatives. Humanity never established formal leadership over this new confederation. They didn't need to. Their example had demonstrated that power exercised through voluntary cooperation was more effective, more sustainable, and more fulfilling than power maintained through the threat of force. The day the Galactic Council realized that humanity would never kneel had become the day the galaxy realized that kneeling had never been necessary in the first place. In refusing to submit to authority they didn't consent to, humans had shown every species in the galaxy that they possessed the same right to stand tall among the stars. The age of forced hierarchy was ending. The age of chosen cooperation had begun, and throughout the galaxy, species that had forgotten what it meant to stand as equals were remembering how to look up at the stars with hope rather than fear.